Okay, so today we're going deep on this movie Spectral
Yeah.
from a few years back, 2016, I think it was a Netflix film.
Yeah, Netflix.
And you had sent this over. You're curious about it because it's kind of a mix of like military action and science fiction.
Yeah, it's like a what if, like, it throws in like real world military stuff and then asks, like, what if this crazy science fiction thing was real?
Yeah, totally. And
Mhm.
specifically, it was these invisible enemies that the soldiers are fighting. I think it was in Moldova.
Right. Yeah, Moldova, like Eastern Europe Civil War kind of
Yeah,
situation.
yeah. So we've got I've got a review here and then a scientific analysis too to kind of dig into. So
Cool.
yeah, so let's try and figure out what exactly these spectral creatures are all about, both like how they look in the movie and then what the movie tries to tell us is the science behind them.
Sounds good. Yeah, and maybe we can even speculate a bit, like, what are some other explanations that the movie doesn't touch on?
Oh, for sure. Yeah. I mean, that's always the fun part, right?
Yeah.
I noticed too in the review it mentioned that initially like they don't really know what these things are. Like, are they ghosts? Are they somehow just super advanced camouflage?
Yeah, I remember that part stood out to me too. It like really sets up the mystery.
Yeah, yeah. And then it had this tagline too, right? Ghostbusters meets Black Hawk Down.
Yeah, like they weren't kidding with the whole genre bending thing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. So before we get too deep into it, can you just like set the scene? What's the basic plot of the movie?
Okay, so basically, it's set during the Civil War in Moldova and U.S. Special Forces. They start encountering these invisible entities that are super deadly. I mean, we're talking instant death kind of stuff.
Oh wow.
Yeah, and they bring in this DARPA researcher, Dr. Mark Klein, and he's got these special goggles, hyperspectral goggles that can actually see these things.
Hyperspectral, so it's like seeing like beyond normal vision, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. It's like they can see a wider spectrum of light than our eyes can.
Yeah.
And at first they're thinking maybe it's some kind of advanced camouflage, like something we haven't even thought of yet.
Right. Yeah.
There's even the CIA officer, Fran Madison, who's kind of pushing that idea.
Okay.
But then a whole Delta Force team goes missing, and they realize pretty quick that guns and normal weapons, they just don't do anything.
Oh.
Yeah, and eventually they discover that the creatures have this weird weakness to iron and ceramics, and that kind of leads them to investigate this abandoned power plant.
Hmm. That's so strange that they would be vulnerable to like iron and ceramics of all
I
things.
know, right? It's like, where did they even come up with that?
Yeah, so we've got invisible enemies, high-tech goggles, a power plant.
Yeah.
This has sounded pretty wild.
It's definitely action-packed.
So what did the critics think? Like, was this a hit?
It's funny, the reviews were actually kind of mixed.
Really?
Yeah, a lot of critics, they praised the visuals and the sound, especially for, a Netflix film at the time. It was pretty impressive. And the action sequences were well done. Lots of people like that.
Right.
And the core concept, this whole invisible enemy thing, they thought it was intriguing.
Sure.
But then on the flip side, you had some critics saying the plot was too simple, the characters weren't really developed enough, and that the movie felt kind of unoriginal, like they were comparing it to Aliens, Black Hawk Down, even Final Fantasy.
Wow. That's a pretty wide range of comparisons.
Yeah, it's all over the place, but it's interesting because the audience scores were actually much more positive.
Hmm. I wonder why that is.
I don't know, maybe viewers were just more drawn to the action and the cool visuals and, the whole novelty of the idea, whereas the critics were looking for more depth in the story and characters.
Yeah, that makes sense. They probably just went in with different expectations.
Yeah, maybe.
Okay, so let's talk about these spectral creatures themselves. Like, what are they actually like in the movie?
So without Klein's special goggles, they're completely invisible. Can't see them at all. But with the goggles, they appear as these translucent kind of humanoid shapes. Not quite human, but definitely giving off those vibes.
Crazy.
Yeah, and their touch is instantly lethal, like I said before, but it's not just like a gunshot or something. It's more like they cause severe burns and also freezing at the same time.
What?
Yeah, it's bizarre. They're also incredibly strong, like way stronger than a human. They can literally destroy tanks with their bare hands, and they move super fast.
So these are some pretty formidable foes.
Oh, yeah, they're not messing around, and they seem to be actively hunting humans. Like it's not random. They're targeting us.
Hmm. Interesting. Okay, so we've got invisible, deadly, strong, fast.
What else? Oh, right. And remember how I mentioned iron and ceramics? Well, iron actually repels them. It creates this kind of sparkling effect when they get close,
Mm.
and they can't pass through ceramics like it's a solid barrier for
So
them.
like a ceramic wall would stop it.
Yeah, exactly. And there are a few scenes where it looks like they might be able to move through walls, but it's not totally clear if that's what's happening or if they're just moving really fast.
Okay, so maybe inconsistent there.
Yeah, a little bit. And then there's also this crazy part where they can kind of coalesce into this like this specter tornado thing. It's
A
wild.
specter tornado. That sounds terrifying.
Yeah, it's a pretty intense visual. And remember that power plant I mentioned?
Yeah, the Mazrov power plant.
Right. Well, it turns out they're somehow linked to that place.
Okay, so we get all these clues throughout the movie,
Mm-hmm.
and then finally the big reveal. What are these things?
So the big reveal is that they're actually molecular copies of human remains.
What, like clones?
Not exactly, more like perfect replicas down to the molecular level.
No.
And they're being animated by this machine that's somehow connected to their neural networks, like their brain activity.
So they're like molecular copies animated by a machine that's using their own brain activity.
Mm-hmm.
This is getting pretty complicated.
Yeah, it's definitely a lot to wrap your head around. And this is where the movie tries to bring in some real-world science.
Right, with the whole Bose-Einstein condensate thing.
Exactly. So the movie explains that these creatures are made of something called a Bose-Einstein condensate, or BEC for short.
BEC.
Yeah, and it's a real thing. It's basically this state of matter that happens when you cool down a bunch of identical particles, bosons specifically to near absolute zero, like the coldest temperature imaginable.
Oh, wow.
And when they get that cold, they basically all start acting like one giant quantum entity, like all their individual identities kind of merge into one.
So it's like a mega atom or something.
Yeah, you could think of it that way. And BECs, they have some pretty bizarre properties like superfluidity, which means they can flow without any friction at all.
That's wild.
Yeah, and they also have these unusual magnetic responses. They interact with magnetic fields in ways that normal matter doesn't.
Okay, so this is actual science, but it's being used to explain these, ghost tornado things.
Right, and that's where the movie starts taking some liberties with the science.
Okay, I was going to say, like, how does a BEC turn into an invisible ghost monster?
Yeah, so for starters, invisibility, that's not actually a property of BCs, as far as we know.
Okay. And neither is this whole freezing touch thing, causing burns and freezing at the same time. There's no known mechanism for a BEC to do that.
Right.
And while BECs do interact with magnetic fields, this specific repulsion from iron, like we see in the movie, that's not something we've observed in real life.
Okay, so that's probably just for the plot.
Yeah, I think so. And then there's the whole being blocked by ceramics thing that also has no basis in real BEC science.
Interesting.
And while superfluidity might kind of sort of explain how they could move through walls, it's a huge stretch. Like, that's not how superfluidity normally works.
Right, it's more about flowing without friction, not like phasing through solid objects.
Exactly. And then the other big thing is that to create a BEC, you need these incredibly low temperatures near absolute zero. And the movie doesn't really address how they're achieving that.
Yeah, like how are these things walking around at room temperature if they're supposed to be that cold?
Exactly. So, yeah, it's clear that they're taking some creative liberties with the science to make it work for the story. Right. So they're using real science as like a jumping off point,
Right.
but then adding a lot of Hollywood magic on top of it.
Exactly.
So I'm curious, were there any other scientific ideas in those sources we looked at, even if they're not like full-blown explanations?
Yeah, there were a few mentions of some more speculative ideas, things that weren't really explored in the movie but are still interesting to think about.
Okay, like what?
Well, one was this idea of super advanced camouflage, like maybe so advanced that it actually bends light around the object, making it appear invisible.
Interesting. So like a cloaking device?
Yeah, exactly. Something straight out of Star Trek, but, way beyond anything we can currently do.
Right.
And then there were also some mentions of other exotic states of matter or energy, like maybe they're made of something we haven't even discovered yet.
Okay. Any examples?
Well, they talked about things like organized plasma or even dark matter, that mysterious stuff that makes up most of the universe.
Yeah, I've heard of that.
And then there were some really far out ideas too, like maybe they're somehow using quantum entanglement or projection to create these spectral beings.
Okay, now that's getting really theoretical.
Yeah, definitely. But I thought it was interesting that the sources use this term quantum zombies to kind of sum up the movie's blend of biology and quantum physics.
Quantum zombies.
Yeah.
I love it. It really captures that kind of eerie sci-fi vibe.
Right.
Okay, so back to the iron and ceramic thing, because that really stood out to me. If these things are BECs, is there any real scientific reason why they would be repelled by iron and blocked by ceramics?
Honestly, no. As far as we know, there's no established scientific mechanism for a BEC to interact with those materials in those specific ways, especially at the macroscopic level. We're talking about a whole creature being repelled by a chunk of iron, not just a few atoms.
Right, right.
So, yeah, it seems like that was more of a plot device, something to give the humans a way to fight back against these seemingly unstoppable beings.
Yeah, you got to give the heroes a chance somehow. Okay, so last thing I want to touch on is their consciousness. Because the movie says they're based on these replicated neural networks, like copies of brain activity.
Right.
So what does that mean for their consciousness? Like, are they aware? Are they thinking? Are they feeling?
Well, that's where things get really tricky. Our current understanding of consciousness is that it arises from the complex activity of the brain, the firing of neurons, the connections between different areas, all that stuff.
Right.
So the idea that you could transfer or somehow sustain consciousness in a non-biological form, like a BEC, that's highly speculative, there's really no scientific consensus on whether that's even possible.
Yeah, we're getting into some real philosophical territory here.
Definitely.
But in the movie, these creatures are definitely acting with purpose. I mean, they're hunting humans. They're working together. They're not just mindless blobs.
Right. And the movie kind of implies that their aggression, their purpose might be linked to some residual neural activity from the original humans. Like maybe some echoes of their thoughts or emotions are still present in these copies.
Well, that's interesting. So like a ghost in the machine kind of thing.
Yeah. Or maybe it's something about the creation process itself. Maybe the way they're animated somehow imbues them with this drive to attack humans.
So we're left with a lot of questions about what it means to be conscious and what actually survives after death.
Definitely, it's something to ponder.
Okay, so just to wrap things up, it seems like Spectral is really more about the visual spectacle and the action than the hard science.
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. It's definitely a fun action sci-fi flick.
And it's cool that they use a real scientific concept like BECs, even if they did take some liberties with it.
Yeah, I think that's what makes it so intriguing. It's grounded in something real, but then it pushes the boundaries of what's possible.
And I think it's really interesting how the critics and the audience had such a different reactions.
Yeah, it just goes to show that people look for different things in a movie.
For sure.
I think Spectral ultimately leaves us with a lot of what ifs. What if we could actually create matter in this state? What if consciousness could be transferred or replicated? And then there's the ethical side of it, too. Like, what are the implications of weaponizing something like this?
Yeah, definitely a lot to think about.
Maybe this deep dive has inspired some of our listeners to do their own research on quantum physics or, explore the ethics of advanced science and fiction.
Yeah, or maybe just watch Spectral and enjoy the ride.
That, too.
All right, well, thanks for diving deep with me on this one.
Anytime.
That was Spectral from 2016. We'll catch you next time on the Deep Dive.
See ya.